It is now. So the next presentation is on the Plantagenets. It's from Jazmine Hutchinson and Anna Sutcliffe, who have both studied this topic in more depth at university more recently, certainly than I have. Thanks both.
Hi guys, so myself and Anna looked at the Plantagenets, and actually what Helen's just said there is actually where I was going to start. So there's actually a little bit of a debate about whether the Plantagenets do start with Matilda and her son, or whether they start later with the Edwards. I'm just going to say Edwards because we all know there's more than one. So that's the debate that starts it. We've gone with the fact that we think, although it's technically the House of Anjou, I still believe them to be Plantagenets because they are. Henry II was the son of Geoffrey of Anjou, Geoffrey the Plantagenet. So I do believe them to be the House of Plantagenet. The only reason that the name wasn't given is because surnames weren't really used up until Edward as widely or as more commonly known. We've done a bit of background here. So the dynasty of the Plantagenets, from what we've looked at, is around 330 years, and it's a huge period of time, and they're the longest ruling family in our history, and they're kind of overlooked in a sense. Like when you say Plantagenets, nobody really knows who you mean. So there's 14 kings, 6 of them belonging to the houses of Lancaster and York, and obviously it does end at the Battle of Bosworthfield with the death of Richard, and later the execution of the last legitimate heir as well. But we were also looking at the strong female protagonists in the story. So obviously Empress Matilda, and how influential and important she is in this entire, without her you don't have the dynasty at all. So looking at Matilda, and also Eleanor of Aquitaine is a huge player in this as well. But the family had a lot of infighting, which is very clear with the Wars of the Roses. So it was an era full of bloody battles, but also major events as well, which is what seems to overshadow the monarchs themselves. Anna, if you could just go to the next slide. Perfect. So at Key Stage 3, I've actually got some textbooks from the school that I'm at, looking at how it's taught. And it's mostly looked at in year 8, in fact solely pretty much in year 8, but it's not looked at from any ideas of who's really in charge. The only person really that is looked at is Henry II and King John. They kind of skim over who's actually in charge and just look at the main events, which is not necessarily a bad thing, obviously, because the events that happen are crucial, they're influential, and they're huge parts of British history. As we've listed there, the Magna Carta, the Wars of the Roses, Thomas Becket, Parliament, Crusades, all these different things are happening. However, we do feel like the issue is the fact that nobody really looks at who is in charge. And actually, when we were looking at this, Anna did mention at university level, when she looked at the Black Death, nobody really mentioned who the leader of the country was at the time. And it's quite an interesting prospect, I guess, that this isn't looked at, and it's the same in schools. I do feel like there needs to be a bit more of a look at, even if it's just one lesson or parts of lessons that do include this. And I've also found, looking at the textbooks, a lack of cohesion with the topics. They're not taught in any kind of order, and it kind of can get a bit confusing for the kids. I found that recently myself in year 8. They're already confused. And we've been looking in chronological order, and they're already getting confused with the different monarchs. And now we're going to go backwards in time again, which is going to confuse them even more. So I do think there needs to be a change there with the cohesion of the topic itself. So over to you, Anna, I guess.
Thanks, Jazz. I'll just let everyone know that my Wi-Fi talking today. So if I do start to go a bit tinny, then either put it on the chat or give me a wave, and I'll probably just hand over to Jazz. It's not a lot I can do about it. But like Jazz has said, the main pitfall really is the lack of cohesion because that is such an important part of learning history, is knowing where you're going from and where you're going to. And especially with something like the medieval period, where students are so displaced in time anyway, because they've probably not really heard of what the medieval period is or don't have any specific schema attached to it. We need to anchor that in time. And so when you're looking at things like Jazz was saying, like the Black Death, like the Magna Carta, which are so vital in knowing when they came and who was in charge, you need to make sure that that is anchored down. But another one of the problems with teaching Plantagenets and with teaching medieval period in general is the lack of focus on female protagonists. And there are so many, even like when we were looking at the Normans and Anglo-Saxons, the fact that those women are overlooked is, well, I mean, it's ridiculous really, considering, like Helen was saying, how vital a role they play in monarch politics and the marrying of houses and gaining and loss of land. So we really need to dedicate some time to those women, and especially in this period when these women actually acted as consorts sometimes. Like one of my favourites is Margaret of Anjou, and she was fantastic, and she took over from her husband when he was catatonic because he was so upset that he'd lost part of France. And so it just shows how strong women need to take the lead, and we need those role models to present to children. And it's also vital going further and further back as we are into the medieval period that we do continue to present this idea of strong women, because we don't want children to think that they are just something that, you know, popped out in the 1800s with a fan and kind of simpered their way through court, because that's not how it happened. And so we need to give actual evidence and actual sources that look at these women in detail. But that's something that the medieval England topic that I'm teaching anyway just brushes over. It brushes over monarchs, like Jazz was saying. So it's not surprising really that they brush over women as well. But it is an event-based history when it's taught, and that is absolutely fine. You know, in another world, we might be criticising this topic if it was only monarch-based. So it is good that we do look at all the events that were happening, but back to that cohesion point, we need to be anchoring them down to something, because then we can look at those second order concepts of change and continuity and similarity and difference. And that's really vital when we're starting to attack some of those skills that children need to be able to look at this era in a bit more depth. And then lastly, we've got that point on the House of Anjou and the Plantagenets. It's obviously not a huge point, but it is important if we're trying to give these children a grounding and some hinterland knowledge that they can draw on. It's quite an important distinction to make when we're looking at lineage, and we don't want them to get that wrong, especially going into things like Wars of the Roses and into the Tudor period. So our next slide is on how we can start to avoid some of these pitfalls. And one of the things that I've seen used quite well in schools is having a big timeline across the whole of the classroom. And obviously you can't really do this at the moment because bubbles are being kept in the same classroom, and so if history went in and put up all their presentations, then biology might be a bit annoyed. But in normal situations, hopefully when we'll be teaching next year, a timeline with key centuries and monarchs, and ideally some events, but that could get a bit controversial because what do you count as a significant event? But even if it's just times and monarchs, really works well as being a visual aid to students and using yourself around the. I've just got a notification saying my internet is unstable, so apologies. But yeah, that's one of the ways that we can attack that. The second way, when we're looking at women, obviously the difference between bolt-ons and slot-ins, we need to consider that, but we've just been given loads of examples by Becky and Chelsea, by the presentation before us as well. We can slot in information and why their role was vital in this period without it looking token. And in this era, as in our modern day era, we should be really getting to grips with knowing how to do that without it looking token, because you know, 50% of the population is women. It shouldn't look like it's a token gesture to include important women from the medieval period as well. And then lastly, having some kind of character work, which is really interesting history as well. It's not just, that wouldn't even be token in itself. People like learning about specific characters. Having some background to that also gives you a bit of a bit of background, a bit of hinterland knowledge on why certain decisions were made and why certain things were important, like having France, like having a successor and things like that, which when you're looking at the Plantagenets, where it's such a bloody period, there's so much shifting of power, there's so much shifting of power over land as well. You need to know why the monarchs were making these decisions and why that was important to them. And so we can help with chronological understanding with that as well. And then we kind of had a little look at what inquiries you could build this into. And obviously at Key Stage 3, some of these might be a bit too complex. You might need to kind of shuttle them down a little bit. But like I said, Margaret of Anjou was one of my favourites. And if you have an inquiry about how important she was in relation to her husband, that's quite an important thing, because does gender completely define her role? Or was it the fact that she became a consort? Or was it the fact that the council still wouldn't let her do very much? It was kind of a mixture of de facto and de jure power in the case of her. And so that's a bit something interesting you can look at. Game of Thrones, I kind of had a little think about this, and then I can't remember the certificate of it. It's either 15 or 18, probably not suitable for Key Stage 3. But if you do end up doing a War of the Roses at GCSE or level, that's an interesting interpretations inquiry that you could build in the whole thing, because it would take them years to look at it all. But if you picked an episode or picked a storyline and compared it to what actually happened, that would be interesting. King John and Magna Carta is a really interesting one, because we only learn about King John really through Magna Carta. And so Magna Carta is obviously a really important thing. We can talk about its significance all the way through history, blah, blah, blah. But do we really learn about King John's efforts elsewhere? And he was actually quite good at other things. He was just a bit rubbish at negotiating and looked like a bit of a sourpuss afterwards. And that's how we remember him. So that would be interesting in looking at, you could look at consequences of Magna Carta, but it would also be looking at interpretations. Why have different periods remembered him in different ways? And then lastly, this would be a really big inquiry. This probably wouldn't be a 4 or 5 lesson. This would be a good 8 or 9. And you'd need to know the Tudors as well. Are the Tudors more famous than the Plantagenets? And the obvious answer is yes. Everyone has always heard of the Tudors. Hardly anyone has heard of the Plantagenets. And there must be a reason for that. Even though the Plantagenets span over 300 and the Tudors are barely 100. So why do we remember the Tudors more? And so you can look at all the events that happened in the Plantagenet era and all the events that happened in the Tudor era, and you can compare them. So it's good for second order concepts like similarity and difference, change of continuity, etc., all those interesting things. So there are some ways that you can build them into your lessons. And then finally, I am very aware of time, so I will be quick through this. We've got some books and TV series and videos that you can watch and read and browse at your leisure. There's some fantastic ones in there, like the second one down, which is all about Matilda, the third one down, all about family, which is interesting in the Plantagenet era. And there's some really interesting quotes from all of them that you can put into an engine in terms of a how far do you agree perspective, and that's always really interesting. But there are a lot of ones on there that do just give you an overview of the era, and I think as a teacher just getting to grips with who came after who, when did it start, when did it end, what events happened, can sometimes be half the battle without that being a pun. And so there you go, that's how you can build that in.
Thank you, superb, and thank you very much, brilliantly, for, you know, it's not often I suddenly have a problem, historical problem, and immediately it gets solved. Thank you, Jazmine. You know, I'll sort you out, she says. I know why your Angevins and Plantagenets are muddled. That's great. Thank you very much. It's absolutely fantastic to hear you challenging this in the way that you're both wrestling to bring the second order concepts and the knowledge in together. Isn't it fascinating as well that I think I'm right that although the Plantagenets end in 1485, Henry VIII's great uncle is Richard III. So again, going back to that sort of looking at those women and messing with kids' heads that way. Do the Plantagenets die, or do they just become Tudors? Discussed.
Yeah, I think it's they execute the males because that's their legitimate heir claim. They just execute the males and they always forget about the females. And I think it's a good point to make, is that actually. Yeah. And
I think something about how were people queens in the Middle Ages is quite interesting. I used to, and it sort of fell out, and you've made me think we should be sort of pushing it back again. I used to do a lesson which actually came out of the old thinking skills stuff, which looked at which kings died violently. And I was thinking, as you were talking, you could do it better. You could actually do the leadership to get the chronological understanding solid. But if you looked at who had a violent death, where they were buried, and whose rule was challenged, you could actually bring in three sort of quite important things. One is that actually most of the challenge was coming from people who were also quite wealthy. There was remarkably unchallenged medieval monarchs by ordinary people. I mean, peasants' revolt obviously being a massive exception. But their burial place would also bring in that sense of, hang on, we talk about these as the English kings, but how much are the English kings? And the idea of the violent death and murder. But then I think I'm right that no queens have violent deaths and murders, and so that might step off into the queenship quite nicely as well. So yeah, potentially some interesting ways in that you could ask questions. It wouldn't take very long, but it would give a lot of world building understanding, if that makes sense.
It's not exactly murder, Helen, but a fifth of English queens in the Middle Ages died in childbirth.
Well, and that's another thing, isn't it? How did the kings and queens die? Gosh, that would get in another whole dimension of life, wouldn't it? So it doesn't matter how wealthy you are as a woman, you are still vulnerable to childbirth. I mean, brilliant point. Last year, one of the trainees introduced me to Blanche of Castile as well. She's fascinating. She's a granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, but also the person writing about her is actually challenging the historiography on Margaret of Anjou and challenging interpretations of queenship. So there's also some interpretations possibilities I was completely unaware of till Francesca put me right. And did you know as well that Shakespeare writes a play on King John and doesn't mention Magna Carta in the play, which is also really interesting. Yeah, the Magna Carta comes back, and I only learned this again teaching Power in the People. Magna Carta comes back when historians are casting around to challenge the personal rule of Charles I. And it's as a result of that it then gets picked up as a freedom charter by the American rebels as they get couched in the time of George III, and off you go. Magna Carta's status is enshrined, but it's quite fascinating how it gets reclaimed. Jess, go on. Yes, Anne Scott's Welsh views of Plantagenet dynasty versus English, because it's an opportunity, isn't it, to avoid becoming too Anglo-centric as well. Do you want to say a bit more about that, Jess?
I don't know a lot about it other than obviously Edward I, I think, would have they'd have a very different view of him perhaps in Scotland and in Wales than maybe they do in England. And I was thinking when you were talking about how famous the Plantagenets and the Tudors are, maybe to Scottish people Plantagenets might seem more famous, particularly because of all the conflicts with William Wallace and Robert the Bruce and all of those things that were going on there. But it's not my expertise at all.
No, but it's a really interesting thought as well. You immediately make me think of Henry II in Ireland in a similar vein. Yeah.
And King John in Wales.
Yeah.
King John's daughter Joanna was married to a prince of Wales at the time, which was an actual Welsh prince, not just the title that the king's son gets.
Yeah, so the idea of English crown domination of other parts of the...
Yeah, Jazmine. I think that's got a lot to do with the schools themselves and our curriculum at Key Stage 3 and the way that it's taught. Personally, I think obviously in Scotland and Wales and in Ireland it probably is taught very differently because of that and because of the links to their countries. Whereas for us, especially when looking at the textbook, like I said, throughout the entire Plantagenet period, they very rarely look at monarchs as like a whole. They just look at their one specific event that like seemed to I suppose like overshadow their entire ruling or their entire like time on the throne as well. And I think the question that Anna and me came up with the Tudors, whether the Tudors were more known, I think it's again to do with the curriculum. When teaching the Tudors, you teach the monarchs, and you just go through the monarchs and you teach them that way. And I do think that's why the Tudors are more popular actually when you speak to or when you ask an English child if they've heard of the Plantagenets or the Tudors. I think it has a lot to do with schooling. And I do think that there needs to be, no, there doesn't need to be a change, but like we've suggested, maybe just an anchoring of each of these events, and maybe more of an overview of the monarch and their actual time on the throne, because yes, like King John, like we've said, is remembered for one thing and one thing only, and him being this horrible man when actually he was really good at other things. And the same with Henry II. Up until Thomas Becket, he was seen as quite a good king for a long time there, up until that point. So I do think it has a lot to do with the national curriculum in those countries. But it would be interesting to look at Scotland, Wales, and Ireland and to see if it is taught differently, and if it is like more inclusive of the Plantagenets, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it completely does. Thank you.